Today I'd like to talk about QuantStamp's assurance protocol and how we propose to secure smart contracts post deployment. So up until now, the industry's focus, including ours, have was mainly on auditing and automate was audits and also developing automated tools to prevent and catch bugs before deployment. Today, I'd like to address what we can do after deploying a smart contract. So we've seen this throughout the past 2 days. The Dow hack was occurred 2 years ago. The attacker drained more than 3.6 million ether. The amount stolen was roughly about $50 million at that time, a lot more nowadays. And as you can see, smart contracts hold millions of dollars of assets and are very high value targets. So this is the simplified version of the Dow hack. Now it's just common knowledge, but it is said to have been prevented if just the 2 lines of code were swapped. So if the user balance was zeroed out before the actual transfer happened, then the fallback function wouldn't have been exploited. So just these little things contribute to tens of millions and even hundreds of millions of draining of funds. So we have to be very conscious about security. People became very conscious about security after this incident, and a lot of tools have since been deployed, have been developed to prevent these attacks from happening before deployment. So Oyente, probably the most famous one, was developed out of NUS. And there's more consensus working on Mithril, there's Mayan, there's Securify, and many more tools that will be developed in the future. Smart contract exploits are not just a thing of the past. Most recently, in April of this year, there was a vulnerability called the batch overflow. This enabled unlimited mining of ERC20 tokens, and this drove down the price of certain tokens down to 0, rendering them completely useless. It also halted trading across multiple exchanges because multiple exchanges were worried that other ERC20 tokens had this exact vulnerability. We actually had the chance to partner with some of these exchanges, so Binance, Coin, and we scanned all of their ERC20 tokens in less than 36 hours. Fortunately, the number of ERC20 tokens that were affected were limited, but having to halt trades for all ERC20 tokens obviously is a big opportunity cost, and some of the tokens were actually affected, so it's not. It was a very costly process. This also happened just last month. Spank Chain from the US was hacked. And it turns out the same vulnerability, the vulnerability had roots in the same exact vulnerability as the DAO, reentrancy. So as you can see, reentrancy has been kind of a cautionary tale for all Solidity and Ethereum developers. But it still shows up from time to time. So it happened 2 years ago. People were conscious about it. People built tools around it to prevent it. But it still happens. So it's something that's probably never going to go away, but we're trying our best to minimize the number of times it happens. So these are mainly the reasons why QuantStamp was founded. It was founded in 2017 by Richard Ma and Steven Stewart. Richard actually had money in the DAO, so he kind of took it personally. We've been building out a kind of a decentralized protocol to secure the blockchain ecosystem and doing it in an automated way. We've also conducted manual audits and have secured over $500 million worth of smart contracts. The most recent prominent one we did was Omise Go's Plasma MVP that was released at DEF CON, and we completed the audit last month for that. This is an example of one of our kind of industry-leading audit reports. We utilize a combination of all the automated tools, but the process is still manual. We still have to go through the code line by line. Sometimes the code can be accurate, but the business logic might not be, or might not match what's in the white paper, what's promised to users. So verifying that is also part of our auditing process, and something we believe that maybe can be automated, but will be very difficult to do so. However, as this data is a little old, but as the number of smart contracts grow exponentially, we believe that it's going to be impossible to manually verify, manually audit all smart contracts. That's why we're building out the automated protocol that I'd like to talk about. So we launched our beta net on August 31st. Developers can request automated smart contract audits. It's a lot cheaper than manual audits. It's a lot faster, and it's going to be decentralized. Right now, we still have whitelist capability to whitelist the nodes that actually run the audit tools and the audit the nodes, but we're planning to decentralize this and open source this next year. This is a sneak preview of kind of what the new UI would look like, and this is going to be released next month. So up until now, I've been talking about what we've been doing and what kind of the industry's approach has been up until contract deployment. So there's contract design, implementation, testing, deployment, and then you actually deploy it and it's out in production. So today I want to focus my talk on what we can do in production and what kind of ways we can do to secure or further assure a smart contract. So we call this continuous security. One solution is contract monitoring. So this is an idea that a couple of projects and companies have been focusing on, including us. We're basically developing tools that can monitor smart contracts for certain vulnerabilities that we know of, something like the batch overflow. Obviously, that can be checked by an audit, but say that the auditor didn't catch it. It can also be kind of monitored, and we can build tools around kind of watching a contract to see that this kind of vulnerability doesn't happen. We can also auto-detect and report suspicious patterns, which might not be the easiest thing to catch in a manual audit, but once the code is live, we can monitor for specific suspicious patterns. This is kind of similar to fraud detection in traditional finance industry, and it's something that can be applied to smart contracts as well. Based on these monitoring tools and alarms, if we know what the exact vulnerability is, we can kind of mimic the behavior and proactively retrieve funds to protect it from the actual hackers. But all of these kind of require a little bit of centralization. There's also the possibility of maybe pausing or freezing a smart contract that's been hacked. But that kind of relies on the fact that there's some kind of centralized element implemented beforehand. So sometimes it's kind of a trade-off if you take centralization over security, and we're trying to find like a happy medium between those. This is also kind of a preview of the UI we're working on for the monitoring tool. But today I'd like to focus on something even more than that. So monitoring may not be enough. So what happens if a new attack that isn't monitored occurs? We want something like an insurance policy, and this is what today's protocol that I'm proposing will be focused on. So we've been working on an alternative approach to addressing our two challenges. It's very similar to insurance, but for the moment, we're just simply going to call this staking. So on the left, we have the stakeholder who owns a smart contract or wants to use it, and he's willing to pay for protection. So I just want to emphasize that the stakeholder doesn't necessarily have to be the contract owner. As a contract owner, you can request audits. You might be the one who developed the code, so you might have assurance that, oh, it's safe. As a contract user, say I'm a user of a DEX or a decentralized exchange. I didn't really develop it. There might be public audit reports available, but I want some kind of assurance that it's safe to use and safe to use continuously. On the right, we have security experts who wants to get paid for skills, and you also have some funds available. So these two parties are going to be part of this staking protocol. So the stakeholder effectively says that being able to reliably use a smart contract is worth a certain amount. So that $ amount is what he's asking for in the case that the smart contract is actually hacked or isn't operated in the way that he wants it to be. Meanwhile, the security experts examines the smart contracts for bugs, and he wants to get paid for this effort. So as I said earlier, these security experts, in order for this to work, must have tokens or must have funds to kind of deposit as a stake. So after reviewing the code, the security expert is confident that the code is secure. So he's willing to stake this much, the brown amount, as a claim that the contract is secure. And obviously, it doesn't have to be just one person. You can have someone else stake the rest. It doesn't have to be an individual. It can be auditing firms. It can be whoever has. It can be funds. It can be just like a large whale who has funds at deposit. But note that the person staking doesn't have to be an expert. So the first person who stakes money should be an expert because he or she is going to be the one to actually audit the code and to verify that it's secure. But other people can actually be kind of like speculators who believe in the security experts, or if the security experts have enough reputation, people who just want to kind of invest their money or invest their tokens can also kind of bandwagon and become a staker as well. So in the case that the contract is actually safe and that nothing happens, periodic premiums are paid out to the security experts and the other people who stake their money. We're still exploring variations of the design, but you can imagine that it would be desirable to pay security experts more than regular people. So the better reputation you have, the earlier you get in onto the stake, because obviously the first few people who are actually going to be staking are the people who are actually doing the majority of the work, should get paid more than the other people who just bandwagon. So we're still exploring the designs and the possible payout designs for this, but in the case that nothing happens, then just periodic premiums gets just paid out. So one problem with manual audits is that it's very expensive. So it's actually, this is not something that I would recommend, but it's possible to deploy a contract that wasn't audited and just pay for the premium as well, because the premiums would be monthly, so they would be a relative lower upfront cost than like a security audit. Obviously, we do recommend the code to be audited completely before it's deployed, and use these kind of protocols and other mechanisms as a way to, as a complementary way to add protection. But it is possible. The main difference between the premiums and the manual audits is that it's a lot cheaper because they get paid out periodically. And in the case that there is actually something wrong with the contract, something happens, then the stakeholder is allowed to claim the funds. So there are still a number of questions that our team is exploring, and the main one is, what is an exploit? So how should an exploit be defined, and can we also prevent backdoors? The most problematic case would be when the contract developer and the stakeholder is actually the same person, or they could collude to implement a backdoor. So say that I'm a malicious actor. I have a smart contract. I know that there's a bug in it, and I hide it very efficiently so that it's hard to track. And then I take out kind of an assurance, a stake on this. So I ask for people to stake their money. Obviously, I can hack it afterwards and just claim the guaranteed money, the funds, and that's something we want to prevent. So we split up the responsibility between the two. The stakeholder has the responsibility to define the bad behavior. So what he defines as an exploit is up to the stakeholder. And the security expert, it's up to them to watch out for backdoors, to verify the code, that there's no backdoors, that there's no hacks. And if he's not comfortable in that, then he shouldn't have to stake any money. So a security expert only has to stake money if he's confident that that there's no way that it's going to get hacked. As part of the stakeholder's responsibility to define bad behavior, he or she also has to deploy something we call a policy contract. So this policy contract is a way to deterministically tell if the contract is being violated or if the conditions of the insurance are being violated. So a sample contract, let's say I want to use a contract, smart contract, and I want to use it only under the condition that the smart contract address has a positive user balance. So in this case, this policy contract would take in the contract address, and it returns a Boolean. So in the case that it's hacked and that the contract balance goes to 0, then the isViolated function returns true. Anytime else, it will always return false. At this point, it's important to note that this policy contract also has to be audited rigorously by the security experts, because backdoors can be implemented here too. You can imagine a faulty policy contracting continuously returning false. But if the owner of the policy contract is able to modify that a little bit, and once the insurance policy, the staking policy, goes into play, he or she can change that so it returns true. That's obviously a backdoor that we would want to prevent. So again, it's up to the security expert to both verify the smart contract that's at risk or that's being considered, and also the policy contract that monitors if that contract condition is violated or not. So the QSP protocol, the Quant Stamp Assurance Protocol, takes these addresses of the contracts and policy contracts and the terms from the stakeholders. So the terms can include things like the amount of funds that they want to receive when the contract is hacked, and the frequency and the value of the periodic payouts that go out to the experts or the people who stake their money. The benefits of staking include scalable verification and assurance. It provides a marketplace for auditors and others to stake collateral. And it removes the burden of assuring a contract from just one party. So previously, it was kind of the burden of the person who owned it or the person who's using it. But now you can kind of disperse the burden of this. So either the stakeholder might share the responsibility or the burden of securing this contract once it's out, and also the auditors. By also adding the concept of this policy contract and deterministic validation of whether a smart contract has been exploited, this reduces the possibility of backdoors and claim disputes. So claim disputes, it's easy because of this policy contract, it's always yes or no. And because of this, it's also easier for security experts to check if this policy contract has a backdoor or not, or if it is valid or not, and only stake funds when he or she is very comfortable. It does, however, limit the scope of what can be defined as an exploit. At its current form, it only works for on-chain validation and simple properties that can be implemented into a contract. This is basically for MVP, but in the future we can think of using maybe oracles to kind of broaden the definition of an exploit and use that to verify whether a hack or a contract valid, an insurance violation has occurred or not. So those are kind of questions to think about down the future, but for now, we're going to start off with this policy contract as part of the assurance protocol. An example of a said policy contract, let's say recently there's been a lot of upgradable tokens, and upgradable tokens are kind of hard to use because you don't know what the upgraded contract is going to look like. So you might have faith in it in the beginning when there's no upgrades, but at any time it can be upgraded, and sometimes it's up to the user to actually trust the contract developers. But a sample policy contract would be, I'm going to use this, I'm going to pay for premiums. I'm going to pay for premiums if the contract or if the token isn't upgraded in, say, the next million blocks. So if the contract, if the tokens have that kind of written down in the smart contracts, security experts can verify that and say that, okay, this token can be upgraded in the future, but it won't for the first million blocks or the first X number of blocks. So that way they can verify it and stake tokens or the funds on it. So that's one example. Other examples are monitoring or figuring out whether enormous transfers don't happen within a certain number of blocks, or a user balance or a contract balance doesn't go above or below a certain threshold. These are some of the examples of the policy contracts that we have in mind for initial use cases. So this protocol fills a gap in the ecosystem of what to do after a contract is deployed. And we believe it's complementary to other solutions. So obviously getting an audit is important. Obviously rigorous testing, monitoring solutions are important. But we think that this is an extra step to add protection, and also a way for kind of more people to use smart contracts for wider adoption of it, especially for enterprises. With this kind of insurance assurance protocol, we think that it'll be easier for enterprises to use private blockchains or public blockchains and smart contract technology. We will be releasing our MVP of this by the end of the year, so please stay tuned. And that is all I have for today. Thank you. Any questions?
So if I understand correctly, basically people can bet that some smart contract is correct. It seems to me that it's probably profitable for you to bet on lots of contracts, even though that you don't know they're secure, because you know that some percentage of them won't be hacked. So I'm not entirely convinced that this really does incentivize people to actually order the contracts.
So yes, I think I mentioned in the earlier points in one of the earlier slides, but it's important to kind of design the payout structure so that highly regarded kind of security experts are paid out more and kind of incentivized to stake their money. So once someone sees that, yes, QuantStamp or Consensus Diligence or all these bigger auditing firms actually stake their money, then that there must have been some kind of auditing behind that. Obviously, yes, there might be people who just stake money in all the contracts, but I think it's up to kind of how we design the payout structure and how we value security expertise more than just someone staking money as like an individual.
Okay, so you could basically say that if you have a track history of betting on contracts that are unlikely to be compromised, then you get a higher payout, basically.
Yes, you can do that. You can use maybe like a TCR, like a registry, to kind of figure out who is kind of an acclaimed expert, and basically changing the payouts based on that.
Any more questions?
So it seems that the verification is going to be automated, because in the other slide I see that you say checking a chip, right? And when checking a chip, it means mostly everybody going to be security expert, because there's no difference between security expert and the so-called non-expert. So how you like go around that bit?
Well, so the validation is deterministic, but obviously figuring out whether that's going to return true or false is going to be up to the security experts. So the policy contract is going to be very simple. It's just going to check a property, but to assure that it's going to always return false, the is violated method is always going to return false, you have to actually audit the smart contract that's being that's at stake.
Yeah.
So that's
But the audit isn't going to be manual or by an automated tool. If it's by an automated tool, then I don't think it's not so hard to be security expert in that sense, right? Because you just obtain the tool and done. If it's a manual, then it will not be cheap and it's going to be expensive, and I don't really see the incentive to doing the entire thing manually and then getting a very small premium per period.
So the premiums, yes. So again, we would have to kind of design what the payouts would look like for the security experts to actually do the manual audits. Obviously, it is time costly, so the premiums have to be paid out kind of consistently and to cover up for their work. Uh, but yeah, I guess the confusion is that yes, there is still going to be some kind of manual work behind the security experts that is necessary to actually uh, to convince them that to get them to actually stake their tokens. So it's not going to be completely automated. The checking part, the verification part. Um, I meant for the security experts, it is going to involve manual audits and it is going to involve some kind of expertise, but we would have to play around with the payout to kind of balance that out with monthly premiums based versus kind of like an upfront cost.
Hi, it's an interesting piece of work as it's sort of opening up this insurance sort of marketplace. So one thoughts on this is, one of the issues we've noticed in the past is after you find a mistake, or what you think is a mistake in a contract, and you get in touch with the developers, you lead to a dispute, and the developer says, no, I don't know, this is intentional, or I'm not sure this is a bug. So what can be done to mitigate that? Because I think one of the biggest challenges is to figure out the correctness of these policy files themselves. So one way I was thinking we could do this is we just say the auditors could just say, I've looked at the code and I think the following conditions are always going to be true, and I'm willing to stake money on that. So if you find an input that causes me to exploit this particular condition, and I'm going to state what condition it is, then show me the exploit, and then you can take my money, right? So have you thought about that sort of a extraction of policy from the auditor itself, rather than from the developer?
We have actually not considered that. So in our initial MVP, the kind of responsibility of setting that policy is on the stakeholder side, but it is interesting to say that I guess auditors can kind of bid for certain properties that are going to be met. If I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah,
correctly.
because the developer doesn't have that expertise, right? Like otherwise they won't need an audit to begin with. So they're often looking for advice on, okay, what do you think? How should I audit this thing? And I think it'd be useful if I'm betting my money and I say I think I've tested enough of your infrastructure, then I'd say that the following things are true, and if you find a mistake in that, then that's that, right?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll definitely bring it back to my team, and we'll try to work on that as well. Thank you.
Let's take as an example one of the most devastating exploits, the parity bug. How is this going to help there? I mean, how much Quantstamp was willing to put money there, and how that amount was going to help to recover all the losses? We know it was like $200 million loss rate.
Yeah, I think it was.
I mean,
in around like 30,
don't you think that
40
this
when it
is
happened,
mostly
or-
for the contracts that hold a lot of money, so those people want to kind of recover part of the money if something happens, or?
Yeah, so in the beginning, obviously, if Quantstamp or if an auditing firm does audit it and they're comfortable, they can stake, let's say, $100,000. You can get maybe
But it's
like
$200 million buck,
Yeah,
$200 million.
so then you can actually get other people who aren't security experts to kind of bandwagon on it as well. That's the part of the scaling, the assurance. So you can have individuals, you can crowdfund it, or you can have even funds or people who believe in Quantstamp or who know that, or certain other auditing firms or individuals with high reputation. So the good thing about this is that Quantstamp or one party doesn't have to cover the entire policy. You can crowdfund that, and it doesn't have to include all security experts. So that's the part about the scalability of this insurance. And obviously, $200 million is a lot of money. I guess there's things that we have to kind of think about, whether if I say I want $200 million coverage, Is it going to go into effect if $200 million is kind of collected or crowdfunded, or is it only going to cover up to however was crowdfunded? So, I guess there's two ways. So, if you take like Indiegogo, the crowdfunding platform, I think you can get paid out even if you don't meet your goal, or it might have been the reverse. But there's ways to kind of, so if you aren't able to kind of collect $200 million, you might just have a policy that covers $50 million or $10 million. And that can be up to the policy or the stakeholder to decide if I want that kind of partial coverage or not.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, just a comment on the last part and then a question. Just to remark that, insurance is a matter of trade-offs, right? So, for example, right, satellite insurance, satellites frequently blow up on rockets, and the insurance companies know that, and it is still business. So it's obviously it's quite expensive to insure, and so forth, right? So the amount insured doesn't matter, right? It's a question of whether someone's willing to do that business or not. And satellites blow up all the time. Rockets are pretty, probably a rocket blowing up is pretty high, right? Sorry, that was just a remark on insurance. It's nothing to do with blockchains per se. So it wasn't clear to me how powerful the policy, sorry, what's the thing called, the policy program?
Policy contracts?
Policy contract act is, because maybe there's some things you can't express. So for example, the DAO hack, can it be expressed in the policy contract?
The DAO hack.
I mean, just take any favorite hack you like, which is the non-trivial one.
Well, you can
And
say that, for example, the certain balance. You can look at balances, right? That it doesn't go below a certain threshold or doesn't exceed a certain threshold in X number of time or X number of blocks. So you can kind of generalize it that way. We understand that having this policy contract also limits what we can do with this protocol. That's why we want to open it up to kind of off-chain validation or kind of using an oracle. But in the beginning, we're starting off with this kind of limited scope of having to have a policy contract.
Sure. But there might be limitations on what can be done.
Yeah,
In some sense, the policy contract can only express, I think,
Yeah.
something local, and maybe a condition which is more powerful than a local one may not be achievable.
Yes. So basically, anything that just can be written in Solidity code is the current scope. But we would like to explore further options to kind of expand that scope in the future. Thank you very much.